Secrets of a Sun King by Emma Carroll. Part 1. London, November 1922. With intense excitement, I drew back the bolts. Howard Carter, archaeologist. Chapter 1. One filthy, wet Wednesday morning, the world stopped making sense. I wish I could say I'd been expecting it, like those clever people who smell thunderstorms or feel tidal waves before they hit, but that wasn't quite how it happened. We'd been eating breakfast, Mum and me, bumping our knees under the tiny kitchen table as we polished off the last of the bread and dripping. I'd be hungry again within the hour. I always was. I was also dreading school, so you could say the day had started as grim as any other, until, I saw the headline in the morning paper. Human feet found in Bloomsbury townhouse. Is it true? I asked, baffled. Mum was scanning the inside pages for the death notices and horoscopes, which were the bits she always read first. Is what true, pet? I pointed to the article. Can I see? Because it was just the sort of queer story that'd stick in my head all day if I didn't read it. Mum turned to the front page with a frown. Your dad wouldn't think much of you filling your brain with this, Lil, she said, once she'd read it herself. No, he probably wouldn't. Dad wanted his daughter to be quiet, hard-working, with her nose always in a textbook. And I was like this, but I could be fierce if I had to be. I wasn't good at niceties or looking neat for school, which was why when Mum cut my hair off with the dressmaking scissors, Dad didn't object. Better a daughter with boy-short hair than one whose plaits were always unravelling. Meanwhile, across the kitchen table, Mum was still holding the newspaper. Oh, come on, let me. Dad's not even here, I pointed out. He's gone to work early, as usual. Selling carpets door to door. Mum said he was lucky to have a job when, since the war, times were hard for everyone. She worked in Woolworths, and no amount of lipstick could hide how tired she always looked. But at least we had a roof over our heads, a sloping attic one, because our rooms were on the very top floor, which was all right until you needed the privy. Then you'd have to go down 4 flights of stairs to the backyard, where you'd pray to remember to bring lave paper, and that there weren't any rats waiting to nip you. Imagine being in the trenches then, Bobby Fitzpatrick, who lived in the ground floor flat, used to say. The Frenchy rats were bigger than baby pigs, so father told me. My dad never spoke about the war, yet 4 years later you still felt it everywhere, every day, like a gritty layer of dust. You'd notice men who'd once been soldiers now begging on street corners, unable to work because of blindness or burns or missing arms and legs. And those were the injuries you could see. I'd overheard enough adults whispering to know the war did funny things to people. We were lucky that all Dad had to show for it was a tremble in his hands. On the outside, at least, he was all in one piece. Gulping down the last of my breakfast, I wiped my fingers on my school skirt and then asked Mum again for the newspaper. I still wanted to read about the human feet. Mum passed it to me. Quickly then, or you'll be late. It didn't take long to read the story. As I'd suspected, it was a very odd turn of events. The police, the report said, had been called to central London address, where they found a man's feet on his hearthrug. The rest of him had vanished. His coat and hat were still hanging in their usual place in the hallway. Police named the man as Professor Selim Hanawati, a scholar of Middle Eastern art. Where's Professor Hanawati now? I asked Mum. I didn't suppose he could have gone far without his feet. She gave me a narrow look. The poor man burned to death, Lillian. Every bit of him, apart from what they found. It's called spontaneous human something or other. Even with half a name, it didn't make much sense to me. People's bodies didn't burn by themselves. Mum took the paper from me gently. You've frightened yourself now, haven't you? No, but it had stirred me up rather, and Mum, noticing this, as she always did, quickly honed in on another news story. Look, Lil, that archaeologist Howard Carter's gone back to Egypt to start digging again for Tutankhamun's tomb. One last go, apparently. Your granddad'll be interested, won't he? He wouldn't. Grandad had no time for Mr. Carter. That glory boy, he'd called him. Without Lord Carnarvon's money, he wouldn't even afford the train ride to London. Only because it's Egypt, I said to Mum. To say my granddad adored Egypt was an understatement. He'd named his Siamese cat Nefertiti after the Queen. He'd travelled there years ago and been in love with the place, ever since. It rubbed off on me, this fascination of his. Not that I'd a flying pig's chance of ever going there, but still. As for the feet story, I couldn't shake it off. It stayed with me all day, through Latin, French, triple maths, and a science lesson about flammable liquids, bizarrely. To be blunt, school was a drag. I hated the place. Or more precisely, St Kilda's College for Girls. Everyone was so proper and so snooty with it. Yet listening to Mum and Dad, you'd have thought our ship well and truly had come in when the scholarship offer arrived. Such an opportunity, Lillian! It's your chance for a brighter future. But believe me, life was much simpler when I went to the same school as the other kids on our street. When I got home that night, the lights were off in our flat. The stove was cold. Dad was normally back before me, so it was a bit unusual. On the table, propped up against the salt pot, was a note from Mum. We weren't a note leaving type of family, so I knew straight away something had happened. And the jolt in my stomach told me the news was bad. Skimming the message, I saw the words hospital and Grandad, which troubled me even more. Only very sick people went to the hospital. You had to pay for your treatment, and Grandad always said plenty of folks who went in never came out again. Guessing poor Nefertiti would be worried too. I took the spare key to Grandad's from its hook. I didn't want to stay here on my own, imagining awful things. I'd go feed his beloved cat instead. Grandad lived a few streets away above a shop that, according to the tatty sign over the door, sold rarities and antiquities, though I'd never seen him sell a single thing. Inside was a treasure trove of maps, vases, packed boxes, and mouldy Turkish carpets stacked against the walls. He'd collected it from all of his travels, though Mum reckoned it was mostly rubbish and he needed to get a cleaner in. I covered the short distance to Grandad's at record pace. It was getting dark, the street lamps already lit, and the rain that had dampened me on the way back from school had turned to sleet. For November, it was unusually cold. Grandad's shop was shut and dark. His room above it had their own entrance round the back, through a gate and down a side alley. As I lifted the gate latch, something warm rubbed against my legs, making me jump. "Oh, Cat!" I gasped out loud. Nefertiti bounded ahead of me down the alley to wait on the back doorstep. It wasn't pitch dark by here, by any means. The streets all around were well lit. Yet a strange, shivery feeling came over me. I didn't want to go any further, and I certainly didn't want to go inside Grandad's flat. Don't be stupid, I told myself. I'd only been here a few days ago for our usual Saturday afternoon tea. Yet even that, usually my favourite part of the week, had been a little bit odd. We'd been drinking what Grandad called chai. Dark, sugary tea in little glasses, Egyptian style. It was a habit he'd picked up from his travels. Nefertiti, as usual, was draped like a fur stole around his shoulders. I'd never seen her sit like that on anyone else. "Well, Lily," Grandad announced, being the only person not to call me plain old Lil, "I've been thinking. I need to put my things in order, and I could do with your help." Now, Grandad was often saying random things, which is one reason why I thought him so splendid. His cleverness didn't come from books or colleges, but from going out in the world and getting grubby with it. You never knew quite what he'd come up with next. On Saturday, though, he'd been coughing, enough for me to wonder if he wasn't well. "What things?" I asked, though from the look in his face it was obvious he wasn't talking about housework. He meant to write a will, and this alarmed me. "You're not ill, are you?" "Ill? Nah, tough as an old saddlebag, me." Yet he quickly fell serious. "It's for a friend of mine from years back who's poorly. He wrote to me this week for the first time in years. Troubled, he was, about something that happened between us a long time ago. We made a mistake, you see, and he's asking me to put it right." "So it's like his dying wish?" I said, because it sounded very mysterious. "I sincerely hope not," Grandad glared at me. "He sent me something to read. The writing's tiny and I can't find my blasted spectacles anywhere." Which wasn't surprising, given how untidy Grandad was. But by now it was already 5 o'clock. Time for me to go. We'd agreed I'd pop by another time to help him read it. "Promise me you won't mention any of this to your mother," Grandad said. "You know how she's inclined to fuss." We both knew what Mum was like. I felt pleased to be trusted with something decent like a secret. When at home, all I got to be responsible for were things like washing the supper dishes or making the beds. This was far more exciting. "I'll not say a word to her, promise." "Or your father," Grandad added. I nodded. Not that I ever spoke to Dad about Grandad. The two of them hadn't shared a civil word in years. It was one of those family oddities you just knew, without being told exactly why. Grandad tapped the side of his nose. "Good girl, Lily. The nut doesn't reveal the tree it contains. It's an old Egyptian proverb, worth remembering." It was this I was thinking of now as I stood at Grandad's door, telling myself not to be stupid. The only difference with his flat tonight was Grandad wasn't there. Yet the odd, chilly feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't just me, either. The cat sensed it too. In one swift leap, Nefertiti was on the neighbour's wall, fur on end. "What's the matter, Crosspatch?" I asked her. She made a yowling noise that Grandad said was her way of talking. She wouldn't be coaxed down, not even with a square of chocolate I'd found in my coat pocket. So much for feeding her. and she wouldn't even come near me. Even more bizarre was the key in the door. However much I twisted and jiggled it, the lock wouldn't open. I was in a right old fluster and ready to give up and go home when I saw a parcel. The postman had left it on the doorstep behind the empty milk bottles. I bent down to pick it up. It was quite heavy, about the size of a shoebox, and wrapped in brown paper that was already wrinkled with damp. The name on the front was Grandad's, Mr. Ezra Wilkinson. Ezra, a funny old-fashioned name that Mum said was always given to the men in our family. My middle name, Ella, was as close to it as a girl's name could be. Turning the parcel over to read the sender's name, I was in for a whopping great surprise. Professor Salim Hanawati. It was the man who'd died, who'd left behind his feet. And now it seemed he'd left something else, this time specifically for Grandad. Chapter 2. I headed straight home, clutching the parcel to my chest. Being back amongst the streetlights, traffic, people going about their evening business, I hoped everything would seem a bit less weird. It didn't. I felt stunned. My brain, never good at staying quiet, leapt from one thing to the other as I walked. My granddad, in his younger days, had travelled to Egypt, Turkey, Palestine to buy copies of ancient relics to sell. Professor Hanawati was a Middle Eastern art expert. So did that mean that this professor, this dead man, was an old friend Grandad had told me about, who'd got back in touch after all these years? He'd certainly never mentioned him before now, nor had he talked about the mistakes from his past. I didn't want to dwell on strange coincidences, but it was hard not to, when the professor had died in such a peculiar way, and now Grandad was sick, all within the same 24 hours. Back at ours, Mum still hadn't returned from the hospital. Dad was in the kitchen, arguing with the stove that wouldn't light. He didn't hear me come in. I went straight to my bedroom, which was really little more than a cupboard at the end of the hall, but it was mine, and it had a door in it that shut at times like this was good to shut behind you. Without taking my coat off, I sat on my bed to study the parcel closely. This was Grandad's package, not mine, I warned myself, but the urge to look inside was too strong. I opened it. Wrapped in the paper was a rough wooden box. It was about 6 inches tall and 3 inches deep, similar to the ones I'd seen Dad bring home at Christmas with a bottle of port inside. At the top it was a lid, the clasp and hinges rusty, like it hadn't been opened for years. It opened now, though, smooth as anything, almost, rather creepily, as if it was willing me to look inside. The box was full of musty-smelling straw. Digging my hand in, I could feel something cold and smooth. At first glance, it looked like a metal jar or vase of some sort. I took it out, holding it to the light. My breath caught. It was, without doubt, the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. The jar had a stopper in its neck that wouldn't shift. It was fascinating, that stopper, shaped like an animal's head, with the long pointy snout and stand-up ears of Anubis, the Egyptian god who guided souls to the underworld. I recognised it from the pictures Grandad had showed me, and from our many visits to museums. The lid didn't want to come off, though. I tried pulling it, turning it. I even held the whole jar upside down and gave it a little shake. There were no signs that it was meant to open, no latch or clasp, yet it sounded hollow, and I thought I might have been imagining it. When I shook it, something moved inside. Now, I'd been in Grandad's shop enough to know a nice piece when I saw one, but this jar was seriously odd looking, and the things Grandad collected generally weren't. They were fakes, copies of lovely old things at affordable prices. You could buy them in the street in Egypt, apparently. This jar was a whole different league. It was covered all over in little pictures of animals and birds and squiggly lines, hieroglyphics. Though the jar was grimy with dirt, you could see it was made of gold. To be honest, it was so beautiful it made me a bit afraid. The only place I'd ever seen things half as magnificent was in cabinets at the British Museum. I couldn't think why my grandad had been sent something quite so extraordinary. Question after question bubbled up in my head, and there was no grandad there to answer them, which was mightily frustrating. The only thing for it was to go and see him, not to take him flowers or grapes or whatever people did when they visited hospitals, but to give him the parcel. He'd know what to do with it, what it was all about. I only hoped he wasn't too horribly ill to see me. Out in the hallway, the front door slammed. Wet things were being hung up. The rattle of an umbrella returned to its stand, signs that Mum was home. My heart thumped uncomfortably as I heard her say something to Dad in a low voice. Then she called to me. Lil, you there? Coming, I answered. Tucking the jar back inside the box, I hid it under my covers, and though I was dreading it, went to hear the news from the hospital. What Mum told me was worrying to say the least. Grandad had a consumption in his lungs. He had a fever too, and other strange symptoms that the doctor thought were malaria. Malaria? I didn't understand. How could you get malaria in North London? He got it years ago in his travels. A flare-up of an old illness, the doctor said, and what with his lungs. Mum started to cry, quietly, miserably. It made me teary too. I hated it when she got upset. Mostly, it was over much smaller things than this. The stuff a smile or a pat on the arm would make better. But this was serious, and called for tea. I gave Mum hers with extra sugar, which usually did the trick when she was low. How will he ever pay for the hospital? Mum sighed, teacup in hand. Dad stared broodily at the fire. We can hardly manage our own bills, love. Don't ask me to start helping your father out now. Revived a bit, Mum then started fretting over me. You're not to visit him, Lil. I'm warning you, he's infectious. And Dad chipped in with, She'll be at school, not hanging round hospital wards. So I nodded and tried to look sensible, though my mind was already made up. I was going to see him tomorrow, and they couldn't stop me. I stayed tight-lipped about the strange business with the parcel, too. Mum already had enough to worry about, and Dad, a stickler for doing things properly, would probably make me take it to the police. That night, I couldn't sleep for toffee. Worrying about Grandad was bad enough, but I'd not counted on the jar disturbing me like it did. I'd left the box on my chair, but every time I nearly nodded off, the eyes would ping open and I'd find myself staring at it again. Eventually, I put the light on. Then my mind started playing tricks. Was the parcel moving? What was that rustling sound? Was the package unwrapping itself? It was stupid thinking like this, but in the end, I only felt better once the parcel was out of sight under my bed. My room became familiar again, too. The chair heaped with clothes, a rug on the bare floor, thin curtains at the windows that always let in a draught. We could make it look nicer, couldn't we, Mum said when we first came to live here. A bit of lace, a few dried flowers. I'd pulled a face and she sighed. Oh, Lil, you're so plain and practical. Sometimes I think you'd rather have been born a boy. Actually, she had a point. Yet as soon as she'd said it, she kissed the top of my head and insisted she didn't mean it. Even now, the only decoration was on the wall above my bed, where I'd stuck a postcard Grandad bought me on our last visit to the British Museum. It was of the Rosetta Stone, that big grey slab covered in ancient writing that meant the rest of the world could translate hieroglyphics. Turning out my bedside lamp, I hoped I'd finally get some sleep, but instead the darkness swirled with ancient symbols. When I tried to think of something else, I kept coming back to Egypt, only this time it was today's other news story, the one about Howard Carter and Tutankhamun's tomb. Despite what Grandad thought of Mr. Carter, people were fascinated by the story. There was something about it, a brave explorer searching for unknown treasures, that captured the imagination like a good old-fashioned adventure tale, the sort Dad would have read as a boy. I devoured them myself too sometimes, when my Latin homework got too dull. For years, archaeologists had been digging in the place they'd called the Valley of the Kings. They discovered plenty of royal tombs, those of Thutmose and Ramses II being two of the most famous ones, yet no one had ever found the pharaoh Tutankhamun. They'd given up looking, all except for one man, Howard Carter. Obsessed with the missing tomb, he was back in Egypt for one last search. Dad said the story captured people's hearts because Tutankhamun had died young, which made us all think of our soldiers whose war graves were also lost. But I reckoned it had much to do with treasure, because we knew how the Egyptians buried their kings with loads of gold. It was a hopeful story too, in a way that the other one about human feet definitely wasn't. The worst news of all, though, was Grandad's. The business with his lungs I'd perhaps seen coming, but malaria? I didn't know you could get that again once you'd had it. Funny how something from all those years ago would come back to make trouble now. Chapter 3. You can't come in, it's rest time, said the nurse at Brompton Hospital the next morning. Visiting hours start at 2. I looked at my watch. 4 hours to go. It had taken a fair bit of daring to get here, when I should be in class at St Kilda's doing a spelling test. Dad had wished me luck for it as he was leaving for work. I wasn't looking forward to lying to him later when he'd asked me how it went. I have to speak to Mr Ezra Wilkinson, I said again. He's my grandad. The nurse folded her arms. He didn't teach you any manners, did he? People from round our way weren't full of airs and graces, it was true, but I could see I was going to have to try harder. Please, it's very urgent. So urgent it can't wait till this afternoon? She asked. To be truthful, I didn't want to come back here again. The hospital smelled horrible, of carbolic mixed with old vegetables. It made me feel ill, which was odd for a place meant to make people better. Please, I begged, I'll be quick. Over her shoulder, I glimpsed rows of snowy white beds. Knowing Grandad was in one of them, just feet away, was infuriating. It crossed my mind to dodge past the nurse. Then I caught her taking in my St. Kilda's blazer, horrid bright red, that showed at the wrists of my coat, and the ugly felt hat on my head and my satchel strapped across me, all of which bore my school crest. I might as well have worn a sign round my neck. Shouldn't you been in school? The nurse asked. Perhaps I should give them a telephone call. I'm going, don't worry, I muttered and hurried back down the stairs. Out in the street, I kicked myself. I should have known they'd be visiting hours at the hospital. Not only that, skipping school was risky. There was always someone, somewhere, waiting to peach on you. In adventure stories, the heroes have a bunch of like-minded pals on hand to help. It was different trying to be brave by yourself. Most of my old friends had been boys: Neddy, Joe, Brian and Bobby Fitzpatrick. When we weren't at school, we'd play crab-apple cricket or bulldog out in the street. Then I'd got the scholarship to St. Kilda's. Can you smell brains? Bobby asked the others on the first day of term when they'd gone down the street to their new school and I'd gone up to mine. They didn't speak to me after that. The girls at St. Kilda's were even harder to be pally with. So some days when no one was looking, I'd get a bit upset. And I felt bad for that too, because it wasn't like I had something proper to be sad about, like a dad or a brother dead in the war. At some point, I realised I was lost. This was a part of South London I'd never been to before. The road was busy with shoppers and nannies pushing babies in prams. Weaving in amongst traffic, the newspaper boys shouted the day's headlines about King George, our new Prime Minister, Mr. Bonalaw, and Ireland now a country of its own. And my ears pricked. Egypt. Courageous Howard Carter just days from finding missing boy King. Experts convinced he'll discover a tomb full of gold. I hugged the satchel tight against my hip. Inside it, in a box, was another piece of gold, a jar so unsettling that last night I'd had to hide it. Even in broad daylight, I'd not completely shaken off that feeling of dread. It didn't help that I knew next to nothing about this extraordinary find. Enough misery mongering. It was hours till visiting hours started, and I was on the wrong side of London to go to school. With time to kill, I decided to do some digging of my own. The bus ride to the British Museum cost me my last threepence. On arrival, I went straight upstairs. The Egyptian exhibits weren't in one big room, but a series of little ones that ran into each other. To my mind, it was the best bit of the whole museum. I loved the dark wood cabinet, the way the floor dipped and creaked when you walked. The blinds, always down at the windows, made a sort of all-day twilight. There were vases, statued called shabtis for guarding dead bodies, swords, beads, even mummified pets. Everywhere you looked, something fascinating glinted back at you, like in Grandad's shop, only older and more beautiful. The Egyptian rooms were usually very quiet, so I'd not expected to find anyone up there, let alone two children sitting cross-legged on the floor of the very first room. It pulled me up short. Oh! The girl who was drawing glanced up from her notepad. Sat beside her was a boy, also drawing, who carried on doing so until she nudged him. Hey! He yelped as his pencil jerked across the paper. I thought you said no one came here, the girl complained. I was thinking the same, embarrassed and a bit annoyed. It was then I noticed the girl's pinafore, red like mine, with a yellow school badge on the bib. She wasn't hiding hers under a coat either, but wearing it for all to see. You at St. Kilda's then? I asked. It came out a bit abruptly, though I hadn't meant it to. My run-in with the nurse had left me still feeling a bit spiky. The girl tugged at her dress. I'd hardly wear this out of choice. And as for that poisonous school hat. She then saw mine, still rammed onto my head. I snatched it off quick. How I hated this stupid thing. The girl thought this was funny and laughed. I wasn't sure if I meant to join in, but she had such a cheeky lopsided grin that I found myself grinning back. No one knew I smiled like that, or if they did, I'd not seen them do it for a very long time. You at St. Kilda's too? She asked. The students are a bit snooty, I admitted. The girl pulled a face. Millicent Thorpe and pals, do you mean? I nodded. They were the snobbiest of the lot. I'd never seen this girl at St. Kilda's, though, and she had the sort of face you'd remember. Brown-skinned, green-eyed, freckled. Her hair was jet black and sprang out in perfect corkscrew curls. Instead of rushing off, I set down my satchel next to their bags, coats, mittens, hats, and scarves, which they'd dumped in a heap inside the door. I'm Tulip, the girl was smiling. Tulip, it sounded daring, like a dancer or a flapper girl's name. She had that look to her, too, tall and slender. I'm Lil, short for Lillian, I replied, thinking how dull my name was in comparison. That's Oz, my brother, Tulip meant the boy. He doesn't say much, so don't think him rude. He loves this museum. We come here all the time. The boy was about 10, I'd say, and looked just like her. He wasn't wearing a uniform at all, which made me think he didn't go to school. The lucky so-and-so. I felt a pang of envy for him and his sister, who seemed quite happy in each other's company. Times like these I wished I had a bigger family of my own. He's good at drawing, I remarked. He'd almost filled a fresh page with hieroglyphics that he was copying from a coffin in the centre of the room. Some of the images, the snake, falcon, and ankh, were also on Grandad's jar, which got me interested. Does he know what they mean? I asked Tulip. He's learning, she replied. Why, do you understand them? Only a bit. I pointed to some of rougher sketches on Oz's paper. That dog creature, it's Anubis, god of the underworld. And this one, with the open wings, it's Isis, goddess of protection. Both were on the jar. Thinking I might be onto something, I moved closer to the coffin for a better look. I'd been in this room loads of times before, but I'd never noticed the name on the display card inside the cabinet. Yet there it was, in black and white. Item 475, coffin of unknown nobleman decorated in relief work typical in the Upper Nile. Thought to date back to 1350 BC. Professor Salim Hanawati, Luxor, Egypt, May 1900. I whistled under my breath, not quite believing my luck. The first place I'd looked, and here it was, a whopping great clue. The coffin, with its connection to Professor Hanawati, might well have come from the same part of Egypt as the jar. Perhaps he'd found it on the same trip. But I reminded myself that Anubis and Isis were often found on goods buried in ancient Egyptian graves, and I should probably calm down. Yes, it was likely the jar was something to do with the death, but that didn't mean the coffin belonged to the same dead person. It's only a nobleman's coffin, Ob spoke behind me, making me jump. If he'd been a pharaoh, the whole lot would have been gold. I suppose so, I agreed. Most of the tombs they've found so far have been robbed in antiquity, Oz went on. So even if Howard Carter does find Tutankhamun, chances are a thief will have got there first. I looked at him sideways. For someone who didn't talk much, he had a fair bit to say about Egyptian burials. My brother Alex taught me about Egypt. He was an expert, Oz explained proudly. Tulip rolled her eyes. Oh, Oz, don't go on about Alex. I'm sure Lil doesn't want to hear our whole family history. Actually, I was wondering what Oz, or this brother of his, would make of Grandad's jar when a woman rushed into the room. I should have realised you'd both be up here. Tulip looked so horrified that for a moment I panicked. Was the woman one of the school attendance officers who made trouble if they caught you skiving? Then Tulip said, Oh, Lordy, Mama, I'm sorry, I forgot the time. This was her mother? She didn't look like Oz or Tulip. She was white, and yet her children both had brown skin. Her clothes were the sort my mother wouldn't be seen dead in, an orange dress, purple stockings, and the brightest red lipstick. Now, I wasn't one to get excited about dresses and stuff, but even I could see that this woman was terrifically glamorous. And how amazing that she didn't bat an eyelash at the fact Tulip wasn't in school. Hurry up, darlings, the woman drawled in an accent that wasn't English. Mr. Pemberton's joining us for lunch. Clever you, Tulip started rooting through the pile by the door, grabbing her scarf and bag. Oz packed away his sketchbook. A flurry of putting on coats and hats followed. Goodbye, Lil, Tulip waved. Then all three of them were gone. The room was suddenly quiet and rather empty. It was odd to miss people I'd only just met, but that's how I felt. It was early still, by my watch, just past midday, but with no more money for a bus fare, I decided to start the long walk back to Brompton Hospital. I went to pick up my satchel from where I'd left it by the door, but it wasn't there. Someone must have moved it. Panicky minutes followed as I searched the room. Then, thank crikey, I found it wedged between the open door and the wall. Except, when I pulled it free and lifted the flap to check everything was still inside, I realised this satchel wasn't mine. Yes, it was conker brown leather with 2 front buckles and the St Kilda's crest on the front, but inside was a sketchbook and pencils and the name Tulip Mendoza with an address in Highgate written underneath. The daft girl had taken the wrong bag, with the jar still inside. By the time I'd raced outside, the Mendozas had well and truly gone. I couldn't believe I'd been so careless. There was nothing I could do about it, though, apart from not tell Grandad I'd lost it. At least I knew where Tulip lived, and I had to admit I rather liked having an excuse to see her and her brother again. Chapter 4. When I arrived at the hospital, Grandad was asleep. He was at the far end of the ward, in a nice quiet spot, said a different nurse to this morning's, thankfully, with a lovely soft as feathers voice. I'd hoped to find him propped up in bed, glad to see me, but as I passed the other patients, my heart sank. No one here looked well enough for visitors. Behind Grandad's bed, the windows were open. The fresh air made it so bitterly cold the bed was heaped with blankets. All I could see was a tuft of his steel grey hair sticking out from underneath. I pulled up a chair. "That you, Lily?" he said without looking. "How did you guess?" "You smell of rain," he replied. "Your mother would have had the good sense to bring her umbrella." The blankets twitched. Grandad's face appeared. I wasn't ready for the shock. It was only a few days since I'd last seen him, but he'd got so much thinner, like his skin had shrunk down to his bones. "How's my cat? You been feeding her?" he croaked. "I've been trying," I admitted. "Don't tell Mum, but I skived off school to come and see you." His attempt at laughing turned into a horrible cough. Mum had worried about him passing on the infection, but what bothered me far more was how sick he looked. "Listen, I've got something to tell you." I dropped my voice to a nervous whisper. "A parcel turned up at your shop. It's from a man called Professor Hanawati, and inside is the most wonderful—" "He sent the jar?" Grandad interrupted. He tried, and failed, to sit up. I nodded. It was becoming painfully obvious how important this jar was, and how stupid I'd been to let it out of my sight. "Why did the Professor send it to you?" I asked. It looks like it belongs in a museum." Grandad spluttered. "A museum? That's how all this terrible business started." "What terrible business?" "The curse," he whispered. He looked sicker than ever, suddenly. Sweat rolled off his face, pooling in his collarbones and soaking the pillows and blankets. It was horrible to see him like this. "It's an unusual jar, that's all. I'm sure it's not cursed," I said, trying to reassure him. He grabbed my arm. "I mean it, Lily. There's a curse on that jar. It took Hanawati 20 years to realise. Perhaps it was only the fever talking, but I admit I began to feel unsettled. The Professor's death was very strange, and the jar had certainly unnerved me. "If I don't recover," Grandad croaked, "if the curse is on me now—" "Shh! Don't say that," I broke in, though it was dawning on me he might be talking sense. Since that letter had come from the Professor, he'd gotten sicker and sicker, and now the jar had been passed on to him. I grew suddenly afraid. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "If this is a curse, what will break it?" "Send the jar back, Lily," Grandad gasped. "To Egypt?" He nodded desperately. "To the hotel. Mr. Ibrahim. Before the curse." I sat back in my seat, stumped already. How on earth was I going to get a jar back to Egypt? "Which hotel?" I pressed him. "And who's Mr. Ibrahim?" "Winter Palace Reception," he wheezed. "Winter Palace? Is that the hotel's name?" He coughed. I tried to help him with a drink, but he pushed the cup away, sloshing water all over the bed. "You have to, otherwise— too late." Another coughing fit seized him. It was a horrible bed-shaking, scouring noise that went on and on until the nurse came running with a bowl. I didn't see what Grandad spat into it, but it sounded wet and solid. When he wiped his mouth afterwards, there was blood on the cloth. It was awful to see him so unwell. The nice nurse, seeing my shock, nudged me from my seat. "You'd better go, love." But Grandad was beckoning me to come closer. "I shouldn't have taken it. Not mine to decide. All those years ago." "He's rambling," the nurse insisted. "Really, you should go." "He wants me to help him," I said desperately. "I don't know what to do." "Give the poor chap a bit of peace and quiet, that's what he needs," she replied. When Grandad tried to speak, he really couldn't breathe. The nurse propelled me away from the bed with her free hand, as with the other she thrust the bowl back under Grandad's chin. "Believe me, it's better you don't seem like this," she said. It was too late for that. I don't think I'd ever witnessed another living person in such a dreadful state, never mind someone this dear to me. It was like being thumped right in the heart. Knowing how much Grandad would hate me to cry, I held on to my tears until I got outside. Even then it was awkward to be sobbing in public, with people staring and hurrying past as if my sadness was catching. Returning the jar to Egypt wasn't going to be easy, but Grandad had asked me to, so I'd do it. First, though, I had to get it back from Tulip. It was too late and too far to go to Highgate today. I would have to be tomorrow, after school, if Tulip didn't turn up at St. Kilda's. I wasn't expecting her to, somehow. Then there was Professor Hanawati's letter to Grandad, which might tell me something about the Egyptian hotel, and, I thought with a shudder, the curse. How strange that only days ago I'd mentioned dying wishes, and now here we were, one man dead, another dangerously ill, and what mattered most was a jar being returned to its rightful place. On the long walk home, I caught myself remembering something from a couple of years ago. Dad had taken us to a funeral, a big one, a procession, he'd called it. Mum brushed off all our best coats, and, as it was a Thursday, I was allowed to skip school to attend. Crowds were expected all along the route from Victoria Station to Westminster Abbey, where the coffin would be buried like a king's. Not that we knew who the dead person was, but that, said Dad, was exactly the point. The unknown warrior was what they called him. Dad explained how in the battlefields of France they dug up four unmarked bodies and chosen one at random. That body could have been a private, a lieutenant, a captain, anyone. He represented all the men of all ranks, all ages who died in the war. Put like that, it sounded grand and honourable. Yet all week in the playground, I was still at my local junior school back then, we'd been gossiping about what would be inside the coffin. Neddy reckoned it was just full of jumbled up body parts because it was all they could find. Someone else, Bobby, I think, said it was actually a dead dog. But Rita Farley, one of the older girls, said she knew for a fact the coffin would be open so we'd get to see for ourselves. I was horrified and fascinated by this idea. Mum had invited Grandad to come with us to the funeral. The plan was to meet him outside Woolworths. From there, we'd catch the bus to Green Park and walk to Constitution Hill, which was one of those wide city roads where the procession was due to pass. On the morning itself, we waited 10, maybe 20 minutes for Grandad to arrive, me done up in my best frock with a stupid bow in my hair, fidgeting with excitement. Mum kept glancing at Dad, who was starting to get annoyed. When our bus pulled up, there was still no sign of Grandad. Dad said he wasn't waiting any longer, which meant we weren't either. Boarding the bus, I was very close to tears. I didn't understand why a funeral for someone we didn't know was more important than waiting for someone we did. Even when the funeral was over and I'd seen the black shiny horses pulling the gun carriage and the coffin draped with the Union flag, which wasn't open at all, I still felt disappointed. All we saw of the unknown soldier was a dented tin helmet, and even that wasn't his, so Dad said. Afterwards, Grandad didn't apologise or explain why he didn't come along that day. In fact, it was never mentioned again. Thinking of it now, the whole process, the dead bodies, the long journey from France, the public funeral, reminded me of the bizarre situation I was in. Maybe back then it'd remind Grandad too of what he and the professor had taken. In the end, the unknown soldier was laid to rest in his home country, but the jar was still thousands of miles from Egypt. Actually, in Highgate to be precise, at the house of someone I'd only just met. Chapter 5. That night at the supper table, I told a lie. Easier than the last one, I said, when Dad asked how the spelling test had gone today at school. He'd caught me off guard. I was so busy thinking about hotels and Professor Hanawati, I'd forgotten the day I should have had. Go on then, tell me, what was the hardest word in the test? Dad asked. I said the first thing that came into my head. Reincarnation. Did you get full marks? No. Which words did you get wrong? Because they're the ones you ought to be practicing, you know. It was typical Dad, wanting me to be cleverer, faster, better. And I did try, but tonight was exhausting. I got up from the table and started clearing the dishes. Lillian, he said sharply, I'm talking to you. Oh, leave her be. She's worried about her granddad, Mum chided. I was, in ways they couldn't imagine. Well, she'd better not be slipping behind. I'll be on to her teachers if she is. Dad shook out the paper. Once he'd disappeared behind it, Mum leaned towards me, whispering, I'm proud of you, Lil. You've got your granddad's spirit, far more than I ever did. There's more to the world than spelling tests, he'd say, and he's right. Dear Mum. She was trying to be kind, but it felt like a nudge in the ribs, reminding me of my promise to Grandad. I smiled stiffly. I couldn't tell her about the jar or the curse, could I? I wasn't even meant to have gone to the hospital in the first place. Times like this, I wondered what it would be like to have someone my age to talk to share private, secret stuff that wasn't meant for grown-ups' ears. Like Tulip did, I bet, with her two brothers, the lucky devil. After supper was cleared and a pot of tea made, Mum and Dad settled by the stove. Every evening it was the same. We'd sit quietly, rarely speaking, though often I'd glance up and notice how sad they looked. Dad, I suppose, might be thinking about the war. As for Mum, I didn't know. Sometimes she'd have tears in her eyes. Other times she'd rest a hand on her stomach and sigh. Tonight, though, I couldn't sit quietly, not with Professor Hanawati's letter at Grandad's, just waiting to be read. Has Nefertiti been fed yet? I asked. I'll go if you like. I knew full well how hard it was to coax my parents out of their chairs once they'd settled down, and it was just the sort of job they'd count on me to do. Good girl, Mum says. Don't be long. A short time later, I was heading down Grandad's side alley. This time I'd brought a torch, but still felt wary as I turned the corner. On the doorstep were 2 bottles of milk and one of cream, and Nefertiti crouched between them. The second she saw me, she stood up purring. Glad to see you're happier tonight, miss, I said, crouching down to scratch her chin. She was probably hungry, I supposed. But when the door unlocked easily enough, I began to wonder if something was already shifting. Now that I knew about the curse and what I had to do to break it, maybe it was a sign I was on the right track. It felt odd to go inside with no Grandad there to greet me. The hallway was so familiar, the crooked lampshade he'd never bothered to straighten, the coat stands, the stairs, the passageway leading up to the shop. It made me come over all upset. Though being in the shop itself felt better, a comfort even. The room was so full of Grandad it was like he was here with me. The shelves on every wall were crammed with books, plates, carvings, more boxes. Even the alarming bits, the strange face masks, the stuffed animals with glass bead eyes, were all reasoned why I loved coming to visit. In the bay window was Grandad's desk, messy as ever. I flicked through coal bills, newspaper clippings, a few fair of which I noticed were to do with Egypt, and more specifically, Mr. Carter. Moving a heap of notebooks aside, I found a half-eaten corned beef sandwich. A quick sniff confirmed it had been there for some time, longer than Grandad had been sick. He was like me where food was concerned. It'd take something really shocking to put him off what he was eating. What looked to be Dr. Hanawati's letter was underneath the sandwich. It wasn't a short one either, but a good 5 or 6 pages long, and covered in stale breadcrumbs. The paper was tissue thin and a lovely, unusual blue colour. I scanned it for a signature, which oddly was at the bottom of the very first page. Like most people's, it was a squiggle, but I was able to recognise the H at the start of the name and the T at the end, so I knew what I was looking for. I sat down in the nearest chair. It felt strange to be about to read a dead man's letter, a bit eerie, a bit sad, but I was intrigued to hear what he had to say. Dear Ezra, it began. You will know how hard it is for me to admit being wrong, but I must tell you, your instincts regarding the Egyptian canopic jar were right all along. It does, I fear, carry a terrible curse. We should have left it in Egypt where it belongs. The death of a young boy just days after he discovered it, that queer little rock-faced tomb, was no accident, nor should we have argued and fought over the jar. We were good chums, Ezra, but we let the jar breed bad feelings between us. It poisoned our friendship, I'm sad to say. Many years ago, you told me never to darken your door again, and I respected your wish. Now I find I must communicate with you. I have important, terrible news. Neither of us knew there was anything inside the jar, did we? Yet recently I've discovered it holds a secret. Let me explain. For years, the jar stayed packed away in my attic, all but forgotten. Last month, something changed. For some unknown reason, the jar began to play on my mind, and when I retrieved it from the attic, I heard a rattling sound indicating an object was inside. It struck me as strange that neither you nor I had heard such a sound when we brought the jar home all that time ago, in such unhappy circumstances. On removing the lid, which took considerable effort, I found a papyrus scroll, rolled up tightly, folded and tied with a leather thong. There was also something stuffed into the base of the jar, a scrap of old linen, probably, that couldn't dislodge. It was a scroll that captivated my interest, and so I set about trying to translate it. The writing was hard to decipher. It wasn't the hieroglyphs I would have expected to see in an important document, but the informal Demotic Egyptian of a personal account. I spent hours, days at my desk poring over this discovery. As finds go, it was almost as exciting as our first sighting of the jar itself. Remember that, Ezra? How we swooned when we saw it on the market stall. We could not believe Mr. Carter had dismissed it as an insignificant piece. How stupid would he feel now if he could read this translation? When you see whose name appears at the very start of the account, you will understand my elation. Yet, I have to warn you, my excitement was short-lived. On commencing the translation, I was overcome with a terrible feeling of dread. I can't describe it more eloquently than that. These past couple of weeks I've suffered nightmares, headaches, fevers. The doctor says it's nervous exhaustion, but I know it's something more sinister, Ezra, something linked to the jar. Of course no one believes me. My own dear wife looks at me across the dinner table each night as if I were insane. I assure you I am not. The jar is back in its box. I cannot bear to look at it or even have it in my study with me any more. Every day I live in fear of some nameless terror. The curse is upon me. Much more of this, and I will have to rid myself of the jar for my safety and well-being. Perhaps I might return it to you, who always understood its power better than me. Meanwhile, I send you what of the scroll I have translated so far. There is more to come, but my progress is proving slower with what remains. You'll be interested to read it, I know, and can, I hope, be of help. Your old friend, Salim Hanawati. I sat with my head in my hands. The letter was a lot to digest. How uncanny that Professor Hanawati had guessed something awful was going to happen to him. It made me more scared for Grandad, too, because the letter confirmed that the curse really did exist. So why, after all these years, had it started up again? And what was wrapped in the linen at the bottom of the jar? There was no mention of the hotel Grandad spoke about either. The remaining sheets of paper in my hand were the translation, I guessed. Grandad was right, the writing was tiny and cramped. So much I had to move closer to the lamp to read it properly. Thebes, ancient Egypt, March 1323 BC. I, Lysandra, have been trusted to scribe the final days of our king, Tutankhamun. Be warned, this is not the official account. Mine is about the boy who didn't want to be pharaoh, the one who was at his happiest, pelting my brother with pomegranates. I stopped, reading the first lines again. This was about Tutankhamun. The Tutankhamun, who Howard Carter was so desperate to find, whose name was in the news almost every day now. Just in case I got it wrong, I held the paper directly under the light. Nope, the name was there, all right. I couldn't believe what I was reading. There's a saying amongst our people, let your face shine, because no one wants to live an unhappy life here on earth, and then be stuck with it forever in the afterlife. So, when I see Kai limping towards our house with a face like an old goat's, I sense trouble is on the way. Shall I call Maya? I ask him. Maya is my older brother and Kai's dearest friend. Only a short stretch of the courtyard separates our house from the steps to the royal palace where Kai lives. That's not his proper name. Maya made it up when he was little. He's been Kai to our family ever since. My brother is taller than any of us nowadays. He has long legs as thin as a stork's, but is strong and healthy and happy. All the things Kai isn't. But Kai is also King Tutankhamun of Egypt. Often, I think he hates this role. It weighs him down, bores him. He'd rather idle his days away with Maya, climbing trees, hunting rodents. Neither has yet seen 17 summers. They are still young and prone to silliness. Our mother pretends not to see it, but I know she doesn't approve. She sews and tuts, which will be her lot for eternity if she's not careful. Kai leans on his walking stick, a little out of breath. Call him in a moment, Lysandra, he replies. First, I need to talk to you. This takes me by surprise. When people visit me, they come to share their dreams. My grandfather was the first in our family with a gift for dream reading. Now, the honour had been passed to me. A person's dreams tell you their hopes and fears, the road they will follow into the afterlife. The skill is to listen, to hold each part of what they say in your hands. A dream is like a melon, I tell people. It's not until you cut it open the skin that you find the sweet truth inside. As I'm only young, 4 summers behind my brother, I'm still learning the skill. I'm quieter than him too, a watcher my mother calls me. She says it's why the gift came to me. Today, Kai looks pale. I hope we're not in for another bout of illness. The fever leaves him weaker every time, and I know I'm not alone in noticing it. There are those who, at the palace, who watch Kai, every limp, every sweat, every meal left untouched. No one watches more than his godfather, I, who Kai leans on like a son to a wise father. He does little without I's approval, and in my view, spends far too much time seeking it. I don't trust I. He has the eyes of a hungry wolf watching a weakening lamb. Come inside, I say to Kai. There is no sun. The wind off the river is too brisk for sitting outside, so Kai follows me in to where the stove is hot because my mother is baking. She sees us coming, bows and scuttles off, tucking the basket of already baked bread under her arm. Please sit, I say, gesturing to the cushions on the floor. Kai shakes his head. He's glancing nervously towards the doorway, expecting Maya to appear. I don't sit either. Bad dreams? Terrible dreams, he hisses. For the last few nights it's been the same. I'm chasing someone and though I run and run, I can't reach them. There's a fresh insect bite on his left cheek. He should have had a net covering his bed. I wonder why his servant, whose job it is to tend these things, isn't being more careful. The fevers that come with such a bite are dangerous. So too are the coughs that plague him every winter. Are you sick? I ask, because this sounds like a fever dream. I hear plenty of them, and they usually mean very little. No, Lysandra, for once I'm not. I'm more interested now. And how does it end, this dream of yours? I reach a dead end, a wall, a locked door, a ravine. It changes every time. He shivers slightly. Behind me, I hear animals growling. Scorpions run across my feet. I mull over what he's told me, a coldness in my veins. I need to hear more of this dream. The person you're chasing, do you see them? I ask. I don't get a good look. Oh, he stops, startled as Maya strides into the room. My brother, wrapped in a blanket against the chill, looks more bony-limbed than ever. Not trying to charm my sister, are you? He asks, giving Kai a playful nudge. He's being ridiculous. Kai has a wife, Queen Ankin Samoon, chosen for him by the men of his inner circle. She's very beautiful, with amber eyes and trailing black hair, although she's almost as old as our mother, which, people say, is why her babies don't tend to live. Go and jump in the river, I tell Maya, scowling. My brother grins. That's an idea. Coming, Kai? Once they've once they've gone to get up to whatever mischief takes their fancy, I let out a long, worried breath I'd been holding in. This dream of Kai's troubles me. The sun stays hidden for days on end. Everything is cold. The ground we walk on, the water we bathe in, the linen we wear. Kai's father was a wayward pharaoh who had favourites among the gods. It brought chaos to our country, and people are saying the god Amun is offended, which is why the sun refuses to shine. I've never known a winter so miserable or so dark, Mother says. She keeps our oil lamps lit all day so she can see well enough to sew. I'm struggling to concentrate on all my scribing work. All morning I make mistakes on the papyrus. Mother scolds me. Whatever's the matter, Lysandra? Come sit closer to the light. But my mind keeps wandering back to Kai's dream. A dead end means something or someone is blocking his journey through to this life and onto the next. It's a bad omen. So too are the scorpions, which conjure up all things poisonous. I can't explain to Mother that the darkness isn't in the room but in my head. We're saved by Maya, who rushes in from outside, bringing the cold air with him. I have news, he says. The king's decided to hold a feast day for Amun tomorrow to win back his favour. Aya's decided it, you must mean, I mutter. Yet despite my mood, I'm glad. I've missed the sun. What can we do to help? Mother asks, ever practical. Your flatbread, Mother. Kai is requesting it. Maya turns to me. You can help Roti with the horses. There's going to be a chariot racing. For once, Kai's dear godfather is letting him have his way. Chariot racing is one of Kai's favourite sports. It's also dangerous, noisy, smelly, and both thrilling and terrifying to watch. He's not taking part, is he? I ask. The thought makes me anxious. Maya laughs. Don't look so worried. It's a feast day, not a funeral. I pray my joyful brother is right.